Hi, I'm Tristan Awayan.
I'm Nicholas Baker.
This is Crash Course AP World History, and today we're going to talk about Vietnam.
You may know about the infamous U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, but today we're going to discuss the overall causes for this conflict and its impacts across the globe.
We'll be starting at an interesting place first, outside of Asia completely. France.
While it is true that the main conflicts surrounding Vietnam and its circumstances happened in Southeast Asia, the underlying cause lies within imperialism, more specifically French imperialism. You see, the French wanted to acquire Vietnam for a variety of reasons, the main two being the gain of more profit and the mission civilisatrice, or civilizing mission, which is basically the French version of the white man's burden. 1887 was the date when France occupied Vietnam, and they did a bunch of imperial stuff,
including social changes. Schools were created, but reinforced French greatness. Local temples, monuments, and houses were destroyed. Political ones. Vietnam was controlled by a series of governors who were often corrupt because they had autonomy and authority. And finally, economic change, the main reason why France colonized Vietnam. The country was transformed by capitalism, based on land ownership, exports, and production, where there were low wages and lots of taxes. The old way of life for the Vietnamese, the farming and self-sufficiency, was no more after the French occupation.
So after all this occupation was said and done, the first step of Vietnam's conflicts came in, such as the formation of the Indochinese Communist Party, a political party that came from the old Vietnamese Communist Party in 1930 and was dissolved by 1945. The party was based on many points, the most influential being on point 5, to confiscate all the plantations and property belonging to the imperialists and the Vietnamese reactionary bourgeoisie and distribute them to the poor peasants. This gave the party a lot of political support, but it was not met without oppression. Some countries, such as the U.S., greatly opposed the communist ideas.
Meanwhile, the Japanese occupation of Vietnam during World War II gave rise to the Viet Minh, a group of Vietnamese communists who wanted total independence. They reclaimed northern Vietnam after Japan's loss in World War II and created the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Among their opposers were the French, who bombed the city of Haiphong. This marked the beginning of the First Indochina War, which lasted from 1946 to 1954. The French fought Viet Minh, who were under the control of Ho Chi Minh, and in a surprise turn of events, the French lost. The Geneva Conference, or the Geneva Accord, granted independence to Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, but resulted in a provisional division of Vietnam into the North and the South. As North Vietnam shifted to communism, a theory arose known as the domino effect theory, which lasted from the 50s into the 80s. The belief was that if one country became communist, then that communism would spread into the neighboring countries and so on.
To quote Dwight D. Eisenhower, finally, you have broader considerations that might follow what you would call the falling domino principle. You have a row of dominoes set up, you knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is the certainty that it will go over very quickly. So you could have a beginning of a disintegration that could have the most profound influences. U.S. involvement began soon around this time. The Southeast Asia Treaty Organization was formed in 1954 after the independence of Vietnam was declared. The organization was between U.S., France, Great Britain, New Zealand, Australia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Pakistan. Its main purpose was to prevent communism from spreading around the region. The name itself is ironic because only two Southeast Asian countries, Thailand and the Philippines, were part of it. Some countries, such as Burma, Indonesia, and Malay, didn't support the organization for such reasons as wanting no involvement in certain political issues. The other major members of the organization actually had an interest in Southeast Asia. The Australians and New Zealanders wanted their geography, the British and the French wanted colonies, and Pakistan wanted support against India. The SEATO is essentially a very imperialistic idea disguised under the good intent of protecting against communism. The organization goes hand in hand with the domino effect, which is why it proved so effective in getting U.S. support for fighting against North Vietnam.
You may be wondering, what happened during the Second Indochinese War that resulted in such infamy in U.S. history? The Second Indochina War, also known as the Vietnam War, showed its first signs of U.S. involvement when the U.S. military launched a strategic bombing that targeted North Vietnam from March 1965 to October 1968 in an attack known as Operation Rolling Thunder. It was attempted to put pressure on North Vietnam's military and try to reduce their ability to wage war on the U.S. Supporting South Vietnam and its French allies marked the military beginning of the U.S. involvements in the Vietnam War.
The U.S. involvement after Operation Rolling Thunder was a constant descent into failure after failure. The Tet Offensive, launched by the North Vietnamese Army and their allies, Viet Cong, in January 1968 during the Vietnamese New Year, which the assault was named after. With 70,000 soldiers led by General Vo Nguyen Giap attacking over 100 cities and towns in South Vietnam, the North achieved a strategic victory against the U.S. It supported the South, which marked the beginning of the U.S. withdrawal from the war.
Perhaps the most shocking events that occurred during this war were the significant actions taken by the U.S. in their attempts to quell the North Vietnamese forces. My Lai was a massacre in South Vietnam on March 16, 1968. It was executed by the U.S. and resulted in the deaths of at least 347 unarmed civilians. In the U.S. following the massacre, there was a domestic opposition to the U.S.'s involvement in the war. Despite this, the U.S. continued its assault. An herbicide known as Agent Orange, chemicals 2,4,5-T and 2,4-D, was used because it targeted the forest coverings that the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops were using, and also crops that may have been feeding them. However, it had a devastating effect on the civilians. Major health issues such as many cancers and dioxin exposure were common among the victims of Agent Orange.
The war eventually came to a tragic ending during Operation Frequent Wind. It was the final phase in evacuating American civilians and endangered Vietnamese from Saigon, South Vietnam, before the North Vietnamese army could capture it. This event happened from April 29th to 30th, 1975, during those final days of the war. In 19 hours, 81 helicopters carried 1,000 Americans and almost 6,000 Vietnamese aircraft carriers. The surrender by South Korea to North Korea happened shortly afterwards and marks the end of the conflict among the U.S., North Vietnam, and South Vietnam.
The combination of U.S. civil opposition and the North Vietnamese dedication to their communist ideals combined to create one of the more ugly conflicts during the Cold War, and provides an example for future leaders thinking to support the imperialism of a country by another.